The dust of Willow Creek was a fine, red powder that coated everything, a second skin for a land that was mostly bone. It settled in the lines of Evelyn Whitfield's hands as she gripped the reins, a constant reminder of the earth that had taken her husband and given back so little. The sun in the Colorado sky of 1872 was a merciless hammer, beating down on the canvas top of her wagon. Beneath it, sacks of grain, the meager fruit of a year's lonely labor, promised a few dollars at the trading post, just enough to keep going, just enough to face another season of dust and silence. Her farm was a stubborn patch of green clinging to the edge of a dry creek bed, the same creek that had been the start and end of everything, the water rights, a phrase that sounded simple enough back east, but here was a declaration of war. It was a war her husband, Daniel, had lost. Now, the silence in their small cabin was as vast and unforgiving as the plains. At 28, Evelyn felt older than the rocky mesas that jutted from the horizon. The wagon wheels groaned a familiar complaint as she navigated the rutted track that passed for a road. Up ahead, a shimmer of heat danced above a copse of cottonwood trees, their leaves a rare and welcome splash of silver green. It was from these trees that 3 riders emerged, blocking her path as casually as if they were fence posts that had sprung from the ground. She knew them. Everyone in Willow Creek knew the Thorne Ranch hands. They worked for Victor Thorne, the man who owned most of the valley and all of its water, or so he claimed. The man in the middle, a bull-necked brute named Pete, grinned, showing teeth stained brown with tobacco. "Morning, widow," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "That's a heavy load for a woman all on her own." Evelyn pulled the mules to a halt. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs, a drum warning of a coming storm. She kept her gaze steady, her hands tight on the leather reins. "It's my load to carry. Pete, now, if you'll move aside." The other 2, lean and grinning, flanked Pete's horse, their posture loose but their eyes hard. "See, we was just discussing the heat," Pete continued, ignoring her request. He spat a stream of brown juice into the dust. "Thirsty work, riding the range. And we couldn't help but notice you're coming from the direction of the creek. Thorne's Creek. My husband filed a claim on that water," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. It was an old argument, worn smooth as a river stone. "Your husband ain't here no more." Izzy Pete's grin widened, a cruel slash in his sunburnt face. "And Thorne's claim says that water is for his cattle, not for some dirt farmer's wife to be using for her personal needs. A toll is due, I reckon. A water toll." He swung a leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground, his spurs jingling a predatory tune. He started toward the wagon, his intent as clear as the cruel blue sky. Evelyn's hand instinctively went to the shotgun she kept under her seat, but she knew it was a fool's hope. Before her fingers could touch the stock, he was there, one hand on the wagon wheel, the other reaching for her arm. "We can be reasonable," he purred, his breath a foul mix of whiskey and rot. "A pretty thing like you." Then came a sound that did not belong to the prairie. It was not the cry of a hawk or the rattle of a snake. It was a low, sharp whistle of air, followed by a wet, solid thud. Pete's eyes went wide with surprise. He looked down at his chest, where the feathered end of an arrow now stood, a stark and impossible flower. He opened his mouth, but only a gurgle came out. He staggered back, his big body suddenly clumsy, and fell into the dust he had so arrogantly spat upon. The other 2 cowboys froze, their smirks vanishing. They fumbled for their pistols, their eyes darting toward the cottonwoods. Another whistle of air, and the man on the right grunted, clutching his shoulder as an arrow punched through it, sending him toppling from his horse. From the shade of the trees, a man emerged. He moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He was Cheyenne, tall and broad-shouldered, his skin the color of rich, oiled leather. He wore buckskin leggings and no shirt, the muscles of his chest and back knotted with lean strength. His long black hair was held back by a simple band. In his hand was a bow, and on his face was a look of cold, focused fury. The last cowboy, wild with panic, finally cleared his pistol and fired a shot that went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet from the warrior. The Cheyenne man was already moving. He dropped his bow and drew a knife from a sheath on his hip in a single, fluid motion. He closed the distance between them before the cowboy could fire again. There was a brief, desperate struggle, a flash of steel, and then silence. The second man fell beside the first, his lifeblood staining the thirsty ground a deeper shade of red. The world held its breath. Evelyn sat frozen on the wagon seat. The shotgun forgotten. The Cheyenne warrior stood over the bodies, his chest heaving, not from exertion, but from some deep, roiling emotion. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, dark and piercing, met hers. They were filled not with triumph, but with a profound and harrowing pain. He walked toward the wagon, his steps measured and deliberate. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman, but as a hunter looks for a trail. "Did you see them?" he asked, his voice low and rascal, the English words carefully formed. "The men I am hunting. They ride with a brand of a snake eating its own tail. They took my sons." Evelyn could only shake her head, her throat tight with a fear that was different now, deeper. This was not the simple, brutal greed of Pete and his friends. This was something ancient and elemental. "They are children," the man said, more to himself than to her. "Talon and Yanni, taken from my camp 2 nights ago, to work in the silver mines. I was told." Before Evelyn could process this, another sound reached them, the thunder of approaching hooves. A posse from town. Someone must have heard the gunshot. The Cheyenne warrior's head snapped up, his body tensing. He was trapped, a native man, 2 dead white men at his feet, and a white woman as a witness. He knew what this looked like. He knew the swift and certain justice of the frontier. The riders burst into the clearing. Sheriff Miller in the lead, his face a grim mask of authority. Behind him were a dozen men from Willow Creek, their faces hard, their rifles ready. They saw the bodies, they saw the warrior, and they saw Evelyn. "Hold it right there," the sheriff bellowed, his men spreading out, their guns leveled. The Cheyenne man did not raise his hands. He stood his ground, his gaze sweeping over the armed men, assessing them. He looked from the sheriff to Evelyn, and in that instant, a desperate, brilliant plan formed in his eyes. He took a step closer to her wagon, placing himself between her and the posse, a strange kind of protector. He raised his voice, clear and resonant, a sound that cut through the tension like a blade. He pointed a finger not at the dead men, but at Evelyn. "She is with me," he declared, his voice ringing with an authority that stunned the onlookers into silence. He looked directly at Sheriff Miller, his expression unreadable, and delivered the words that would shatter Evelyn's world. "Her body is mine until I have my sons." A collective gasp went through the posse. The words hung in the hot, still air, obscene and unbelievable. Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes asking a question she could not answer. She was in shock, her mind reeling. This stranger had saved her life only to claim it, to bind her to his fate with a public declaration that branded her, in the eyes of her people, as something less than human, a savage's property. She saw the cold calculation in the warrior's eyes. He had not said it for her. He had said it for them. It was a story, a reason for his presence that was more complicated than simple murder. It created a situation the sheriff could not immediately solve with a rope. It bought him time. "What's your name?" the sheriff demanded, his pistol still aimed at the warrior's chest. "I am called Wakinian," he answered, "but you will call me Wak." Sheriff Miller looked from Wak to the bodies, then back to Evelyn's pale, stunned face. He was a man who understood the letter of the law in a land where its spirit was often trampled. He could not hang a man without a trial, not with a white woman in the middle of it, claimed or not. "You'll come into town," the sheriff said, his voice hard. "Both of you. We'll sort this out." Wak gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He had what he wanted, a way into the town without being shot on sight. He looked at Evelyn, a silent command in his eyes. "Drive." Her hands, numb and trembling, picked up the reins. The mules, spooked by the scent of blood, were restless. She clucked her tongue, and the wagon lurched forward, rolling slowly past the bodies of her attackers. The men of the posse parted to let her through, their faces a mixture of disgust, pity, and suspicion. She was no longer just the widow Whitfield. She was the woman who belonged to the Cheyenne. She owed this man her life, and he had just taken everything else. They were bound together now, a lonely widow and a grieving father, two strangers caught in a spiral of violence and injustice, heading toward a town that had already judged them both. The dust rose behind the wagon, trying to cover the blood, but Evelyn knew that some stains could never be washed away. The ride into Willow Creek was a silent torment. Every window and doorway held a pair of accusing eyes, faces that had offered Evelyn polite, if distant, sympathy after her husband's death, now hardened with contempt. The whispers followed her wagon like carrion crows. Traitor, savage's woman. She kept her gaze fixed on the rumps of her mules, her knuckles white on the reins. Beside her on the wagon seat, Wak sat as still as a stone effigy, his dark eyes scanning the town, missing nothing, revealing nothing. He had a wound, she now realized. A dark, wet patch was spreading slowly on his buckskin legging, high on the thigh, a parting gift from the third cowboy's wild shot, a detail lost in the chaos until now. Sheriff Miller herded them directly to his office, a cramped wooden box that smelled of stale cigar smoke and dust. He locked Wak in the single cell at the back, the iron door clanging shut with a grim finality. "You stay put, ma'am," the sheriff told Evelyn, his voice weary. He motioned to a chair. "I need a statement from you." Outside, a crowd was gathering. The low murmur of angry voices was a rising tide, threatening to breach the thin walls of the jail. Evelyn told the sheriff what had happened, her voice low and steady. She told him about the water toll, about Pete's threats. She did not, however, tell him what Wak had said about his sons. That felt like a secret that was not hers to give away. "He saved my life, Sheriff," she finished quietly. Miller ran a hand over his tired face. "Maybe so, but he killed 2 men, and folks around here don't take kindly to that. Not when it's an Indian doing the killing. His claim on you, that complicates things. Makes it look like you were a party to it." "That's not true." "Truth is whatever a jury of 12 angry men says it is." Miller sighed. "For his own safety, he stays in that cell, and you, Evelyn, you should go home, lock your door." But she could not go home. To leave him here was to leave him to the mercy of the mob. And she had seen the look in their eyes. There would be no mercy. All evening she sat in her wagon, parked across from the jail, a silent, solitary sentinel. The crowd grew louder, fueled by whiskey from the saloon. Torches were lit, casting flickering, demonic shadows against the buildings. Their chants were ugly. Justice for Pete, string him up. She saw Wak through the barred window of his cell. He was standing, watching the mob, his face a mask of stone. He was leaning heavily on one leg. The wound was worse. She knew that if he stayed there, he would die, one way or another. A knot of resolve tightened in her stomach. Her loyalty to the people of Willow Creek, a loyalty that had already frayed, finally snapped. They saw her as one of them. Yet they would have stood by and watched Pete and his friends have their way with her. Her gratitude to Wak was a simpler, cleaner thing. It was a debt. When the moon was high and the mob's righteous fury had dissolved into a drunken stupor, she acted. She slipped from her wagon, carrying a small bundle, a canteen of water, a strip of clean linen from her petticoat, and a small knife. The alley behind the jail was dark. The back window of the cell was barred, but the wood of the frame was old and soft. She worked silently, patiently, using the knife to pry and whittle at the wood until she had loosened one of the iron bars enough to be pulled free. It was a small opening, but big enough for a man to squeeze through. She whispered his name into the darkness. Wak. He was there in an instant, his face a shadow in the opening. "They will hunt us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They will kill you if you stay," she answered. "Can you make it through?" He nodded, with a painful grimace. He worked his shoulders and hips through the narrow gap, dropping silently to the ground beside her. He was weak. She could see it in the way he held himself. The wound on his leg was bleeding freely now. They had to move, and they had to move fast. She led him to her wagon, helping him into the back, covering him with empty grain sacks. She took the reins and guided the mules out of town, taking a little used track that led south, toward the river. They traveled through the night, the only sounds the creak of the wagon and the soft thud of the mules' hooves. By sunrise, they had put miles between them and Willow Creek, but she knew it would not be enough. When the posse discovered he was gone, and that she was gone with him, they would come, and they would be riding for blood. She stopped the wagon in a shallow ravine, hidden from the main trail. Wak was pale beneath his dark skin, his forehead beaded with sweat. "The bullet is still in there," he said, his voice strained. She looked at the ragged tear in his legging and the swollen flesh around it. "I have to get it out." He nodded, bracing himself against the side of the wagon. Her hands trembled as she cut away the buckskin. The wound was ugly, inflamed and deep. Using the tip of her knife, sterilized in the flame of a match, she probed the wound. He did not make a sound, but she felt the muscles in his leg bunch into knots of stone. His jaw was clenched, his eyes closed. She focused on the task, her revulsion and fear pushed aside by a desperate need to help. Finally, she felt the knife tip scrape against something hard. She worked the small piece of lead out, a wave of relief washing over her as she held the misshapen little bullet in her palm. She cleaned the wound as best she could with water and bandaged it tightly with the linen. He leaned his head back, breathing heavily. "You have the hands of a healer," he said, his eyes still closed. "I have the hands of a farmer's wife," she corrected him, her voice a little shaky. "You learn to deal with what needs dealing with." They rested for a few hours. As he regained some of his strength, they began to talk. It was not easy. Her resentment over his public declaration still simmered. "Why did you say that?" she asked, her voice tight. "That my body was yours?" He opened his eyes and looked at her. For the first time, she saw past the warrior and saw the man. His gaze filled with a weariness that went bone deep. "A dead Indian is a simple story," he said. "An Indian with a white woman is a complicated one." It made the sheriff pause. It bought me time to think. It was a cage of words. For them, not for you. She did not know if she believed him, but it was an answer. He then told her why he was so close to Willow Creek. He told her about his sons, Talon and Yanni, and how they were stolen from his camp. He spoke of a man named Victor Thorne and a silver mine where children were made to work. The name hit her like a physical blow. It was the same Thorne who had taken her water, the same Thorne whose men had tried to assault her. "I was a scout," he said, his voice low, as if the words tasted of ash. "For the Blue Coats. I thought I could walk in both worlds. I thought I could protect my people by helping the Americans understand the land. I showed them the passes, the water holes. I taught them how to survive here." He paused, a bitter line forming around his mouth. "And they paid me back by turning a blind eye when men like Thorne steal our children. I left them. I walked away. Now, I fight my own war." Evelyn listened. her heart aching with a strange mix of pity and understanding. This man was not the savage of her town's imagination. He was a father, a soldier who had been betrayed. Her own personal struggle with Victor Thorne suddenly seemed small in comparison. Yet she realized they were connected. They were both victims of the same man's greed. A fragile, unspoken alliance began to form between them in the cramped, dusty space of the wagon bed. By late afternoon, they heard the baying of hounds in the distance. The posse was closing in. They had to cross the river. It was running high with the last of the spring melt, a churning, muddy torrent. There was a ford a mile downstream, but it would be watched. "We cross here," Wak said, his voice firm again. The warrior returned. He slid out of the wagon, testing his wounded leg. He was still weak, but his resolve was iron. He guided the mules into the rushing water. The wagon lurched, the current grabbing at the wheels, trying to pull them under. The water rose quickly, swirling around Evelyn's feet. The mules panicked, their eyes rolling. Wak was in the water beside them, one hand on their bridles, his voice a low, calming chant in his own language, coaxing them forward, fighting the river's pull. They made it to the other side just as the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and crimson. The river behind them reflected the light, turning the muddy water into a flowing ribbon of blood. They stood on the far bank, soaked and shivering, looking back at the land they had fled. They were fugitives now, bound together not by his words, but by their shared ordeal. The river was a boundary, and they had crossed it together. On the other side was the law of men, of sheriffs and posses. On this side, there was only the law of the land, the law of survival. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the fiery sunset. The gratitude in his gaze was a thing more powerful than any spoken words. She had saved his life, just as he had saved hers. The debt was paid, but a new pact had been forged in the red waters of the river, a pact of survival against a common enemy. Her loyalty was no longer to a people or a place, but to the man who stood beside her, a father searching for his sons, his pain a mirror of her own loneliness. The world had branded her an outcast, but for the first time since her husband died, she did not feel entirely alone. The far side of the river offered no sanctuary, only a different kind of desolation. The land here was harsher, a broken country of gullies and sharp-edged rock. They found shelter in an old line shack, a relic of some forgotten cattle drive, its roof a patchwork of holes against the immense, star-dusted sky. For 2 days, they rested. Evelyn tended to Wak's wound, which was healing clean thanks to her care. The silence between them was no longer one of animosity, but of shared exhaustion and a dawning, complex understanding. They were tied together, 2 threads in a tapestry woven by Victor Thorne's greed. But rest was a luxury they could not afford. The food she had packed in the wagon was nearly gone. More importantly, every moment they waited was a moment Wak's sons remained in peril. Evelyn found her thoughts drifting back to her farm, to the small cabin filled with the ghosts of a life that was no longer hers, and to something else, a secret she had kept even from herself. "There is something at my house," she said on the 3rd morning, as the sun cast long shadows from the mesas. "Something my husband left." Wak watched her, his expression guarded. He was carving the head of a hawk into a piece of cottonwood root, his hands strong and surprisingly delicate. "The posse will be watching your farm. It is a trap." "They will expect me to run far," she countered, her voice gaining a strength she had not known she possessed. "They will not expect me to go back. I know the land, every dry wash and hollow. I can get there and back before sunrise tomorrow." He set down his carving. "What is it that is worth such a risk?" "A box," she explained. "An iron strong box Daniel kept under the floorboards. He never told me what was inside. He only said that if anything ever happened to him, it held the truth." He said the truth was the only thing men like Thorne were truly afraid of. Wak considered this. He looked at his bandaged leg, then at her determined face. He had seen her courage at the river. He saw it now. He did not like the plan, but he understood the need. The truth was a weapon, and they had very few of those. "I will go with you," he said. "No," she said firmly. "Your leg is not healed. You would slow me down, and 2 people make more noise than 1. You will wait for me. Here." The argument was short. Her logic was sound. And in the end, he had to concede. He gave her instructions, teaching her how to move with the shadows, how to listen to the language of the night birds and the coyotes, things he had learned as a scout. When darkness fell, a heavy blanket over the plains, she slipped away from the shack, a ghost moving through a landscape of ghosts. The journey was harrowing. Every rustle of sagebrush, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through her. She moved slowly, carefully, her senses alive in a way they had never been before. She reached the ridge overlooking her small farm near midnight. The cabin was dark, a lonely silhouette against the stars. There were no horses at the rail, no sign of the posse, but she knew they were out there, somewhere in the darkness, hunting. She crept down the slope and into her own home like a thief. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of memory and loss. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the gloom. With trembling hands, she pulled back the bearskin rug and prized up the loose floorboard Daniel had shown her long ago. The iron box was heavy. She dragged it out and carried it to the table, her heart pounding against her ribs. The key was small and rusted, hidden in the spine of the family Bible. The lock opened with a protesting groan. Inside, beneath a layer of dust, was a collection of papers. They were not the jumble she expected. Daniel, ever the meticulous man, had kept everything in perfect order. There was a copy of his original water rights claim, filed with the territorial office, clear and legal. Beneath that was a second document, a deed of sale signed by Victor Thorne himself, for a piece of land far upstream. It was this document that made her breath catch. It was a contract between Thorne and the federal government, a contract that explicitly stated that in exchange for the land, Thorne forfeited any and all claims to the water in Willow Creek, ceding those rights to the smaller homesteads downstream. The man who had built his empire on controlling the water had no legal right to it at all. Her husband had died over a lie. But there was more. Tucked at the bottom of the box was a ledger book. The entries were in code, a series of numbers and letters. But Daniel had included a key on the first page. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she deciphered the columns. They were records of shipments, not of silver, but of supplies sent to a place called the Shadow Mine. Blankets, beans, flour, but in quantities far too small for a crew of grown men. And then she saw the other entries. Payments. Payments to men described only by initials. Payments for the delivery of unskilled labor. The dates corresponded with reports of missing native children from 3 different tribes across the territory. It was all there, a meticulous, damning record of Thorne's entire operation. He was not just a water thief, he was a monster who preyed on the helpless. She gathered the papers, her mind reeling. This was the truth Daniel had spoken of, a truth buried beneath layers of dust and deceit. She put the papers in an oilcloth pouch and left the empty box, slipping back into the night as silently as she had come. When she returned to the shack before dawn, Wak was waiting, his face carved from the gray morning light. She did not need to speak. He saw the look in her eyes. She spread the papers on the rough wooden table between them. He could not read the English words, but he understood the maps and the columns of figures in the ledger. She explained what she had found, her voice a low, angry whisper. "The law is on these papers," she said, her hand resting on the oilcloth pouch. "This is the proof we need." Wak looked from the papers to her face. "My sons are in that mine. These papers will not dig them out. They will not stop the whips of the guards. Your law is slow. My justice is not. An attack would be suicide, she argued. You saw the men who work for him. The mine will be guarded. We would be killed before we got within a mile of it. I have faced worse odds. And I will not see you throw your life away, she said, her voice rising with passion. Not when we have this. There must be someone in town we can trust. Someone who will help us. A face swam into her memory, a kind face, lined with worry. Dr. Jonah Pike. He had been a friend to Daniel. He was a quiet, bookish man who seemed out of place in the rough world of Willow Creek. A man who treated anyone who needed his help, white or native, without question. He had always seemed to be watching, his eyes missing little. She had the feeling that Dr. Pike knew more about the town's dark secrets than anyone. They decided the risk was necessary. They needed more information. And the doctor was their only hope. They waited another day for Walk's leg to strengthen, then traveled under the cover of darkness, approaching Willow Creek from the south, leaving the wagon hidden miles away. The doctor's small house and office were on the edge of town, a single lamp burning in the window like a lonely star. Evelyn knocked on the door, her heart a frantic drum. Wank waited in the shadows of a nearby livery stable, a silent, menacing presence. The door opened a crack. Dr. Pike peered out, his spectacles perched on his nose. His eyes widened in shock when he saw her. Evelyn, good heavens, child, they're saying you ran off with that Cheyenne warrior. I need your help, doctor, she whispered, her eyes pleading. Please, let me in. He hesitated for only a second before pulling her inside and bolting the door. His office smelled of antiseptic and herbs. He listened, his expression growing grimmer as she told him everything, her words tumbling out in a rush. She showed him the papers. He sank into a chair, his face pale. I knew it, he breathed, his voice barely audible. I knew Thorne was a villain, but this is a new kind of evil. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and shame. I have seen them. Evelyn, the children, men from the mine bring them to me sometimes, when they are too sick to work. The dust, it gets in their lungs. I patch them up as best I can and send them back. What else could I do? Thorne owns this town. He owns the sheriff. You can help us now, Evelyn insisted. Tell us where the mine is. How many guards are there? Anything you know. The doctor was wrestling with his conscience. To help them was to risk everything, but to refuse was to be complicit in Thorne's crimes. He looked at the contract in her hand, the proof of the lie that had cost his friend Daniel his life. His fear finally gave way to a slow, burning anger. The mine is 2 days' ride north of here, in a place called Shadow Canyon, he said, his voice stronger now. He went to a map on his wall and pointed to a jagged scar in the foothills. He keeps 24 armed men there at all times. It is a fortress. You will never get in. It was then that Wak stepped into the room. He had grown tired of waiting. He moved without a sound, a phantom appearing from the shadows. The doctor gasped, stumbling back. This is my fight, Wak said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at the map, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. My sons are in that canyon. I will not wait for papers and politicians. I will bring the fire of my people to this place. And you will die, Evelyn shot back, stepping between the two men, and your sons will die with you. This is not the way. She held up the papers. The law may be slow, Dr. Pike, but it is all we have. If we give this to the right person, a federal marshal. There is no right person. Wak's voice was raw with grief and rage. Do you not understand? Your world and mine are not the same. Your law was written to protect men like Thorne from men like me. Justice will not be found on a piece of paper. It will be found at the end of a knife. The tension in the small room was thick enough to choke on. The doctor looked from the desperate father to the determined widow. He saw two worlds colliding, two different ideas of justice, both born from pain. One wanted to tear down the corrupt system. The other wanted to force it to be true to its own ideals. And they were both right. And they were both wrong. The truth, like the children, was buried deep, and getting it out would require more than just a plan. It would require them to find a way to trust each other, a way to fight together, before the dust of the shadow mine buried them all. The fragile truce forged in the doctor's office was as tense as a drawn bowstring. Wach's desire for immediate vengeance warred with Evelyn's faith in the law, a faith that felt increasingly naive. Dr. Pike, a man caught between his fear and his conscience, was the unlikely fulcrum. He finally broke the stalemate, his voice trembling but resolute. He said that a direct assault was madness, but waiting for a marshal who might never come was a death sentence for the children. They needed to see the mine for themselves, to understand its defenses, to gather not just legal proof, but real intelligence. It was a compromise born of desperation, a plan that satisfied no one completely, but was the only path forward. Dr. Pike gave them what he could from his own meager stores, a sack of dried jerky, canteens, and a leather satchel with bandages and salves. He insisted on coming with them. He told them he had spent years turning a blind eye, and his soul could not bear the weight of it any longer. He knew the foothills, the plants that could be used for medicine, and his presence might seem less suspicious if they were stopped. Wach did not argue. He looked at the soft hands of the doctor and saw another liability, but he also saw the resolve in the man's eyes. He knew the strength of a guilty conscience. They set out on foot, leaving the town behind them like a bad dream. They moved north, into a wilderness that grew more savage with every step. The gentle, rolling plains gave way to a landscape of cracked earth and thorny scrub. The sun was a relentless enemy, and water became their obsession. The canteens were quickly emptied, and the doctor's town-bred constitution began to fail him. By the second day, his face was flushed, his steps unsteady. It was Wach who kept them alive. He was a part of this land in a way they could never be. He seemed to read the secrets of the dry creek beds, the subtle shifts in vegetation. He led them to a seep spring hidden beneath a tangle of mesquite roots, its water muddy but life-giving. He showed Evelyn how to find the sweet, starchy tubers of the yucca plant. He moved with an economy of motion, his senses attuned to the world around him, while Evelyn and the doctor felt like loud, clumsy intruders. She watched him, and the fear she once felt was slowly replaced by a profound and grudging respect. He was not a savage. He was a survivor, a master of a world that was trying to kill them. On the third night, as they huddled around a small, smokeless fire, the sound of a scream ripped through the darkness. It was the cry of a predator, a mountain lion, its voice echoing off the canyon walls. Dr. Pike scrambled backward, his face a mask of terror. Evelyn froze, her hand reaching for the knife at her belt. Wach was on his feet in an instant, a burning branch in one hand, his own knife in the other. He did not shout. He stood his ground, a dark silhouette against the firelight, and let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that was more animal than human. It was a challenge, a declaration of territory. They heard the lion circle them in the darkness, its footsteps a soft, menacing padding on the rocks. Then, after a long, tense silence, it was gone. Wach remained standing for a full hour, his eyes scanning the darkness, an unblinking guardian. The next day, the sky turned a sickly yellow. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange electricity. Wach sniffed the wind. He said a storm was coming, a bad one. He hurried them along, his eyes searching for shelter. The wind began to pick up, whining through the rocks, carrying the first stinging grains of sand. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a howling, reddish-brown chaos. The sand blasted their skin, filled their eyes and mouths, and reduced visibility to mere feet. The sun vanished. The sky was gone. There was only the roar of the wind and the suffocating embrace of the dust. Wach grabbed Evelyn's hand, his grip like iron. He pulled her forward, shouting for the doctor to follow. They stumbled blindly through the maelstrom, the storm trying to tear them apart. He led them to a dark fissure in a rock face, a shallow cave he must have sensed more than seen. They collapsed inside, choking and spitting out dust, their ears ringing from the wind's assault. The cave was a small pocket of silence in the heart of the storm. As their eyes adjusted to the gloom, they saw it was barely large enough for the three of them. The air was cool and damp. For hours, they sat without speaking, listening to the fury of the world outside. The journey, the lack of food, and the constant tension had taken their toll on all of them. But on Wak, the effect was more severe. Evelyn noticed he was shivering. Despite the oppressive heat of the afternoon, a feverish glint had entered his eyes. She reached out and touched his forehead. He was burning with heat. She saw that the wound on his leg, which had been healing so well, was now an angry red, inflamed and swollen. The fine, gritty dust of the storm had worked its way into the damaged tissue, poisoning him. Dr. Pike examined the leg, his face grim in the faint light. He said the infection was spreading. He had nothing with him to fight such a fever. All they could do was keep him hydrated and try to clean the wound. Evelyn took charge. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and soaked it in the precious water from their canteens. She gently began to clean the wound, her touch steady. Wak flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, but he did not pull away. His stoic control was beginning to crumble, worn away by the fever. As she worked, he began to speak, his voice raspy, his words disjointed. He spoke of a woman named Star that sings, of the way her laughter sounded like water over stones. He spoke of two small boys, of teaching them to track rabbits, of the feel of their small hands in his. Evelyn listened, her heart aching. She saw not the fierce warrior, but a man laid bare by pain and grief. His loss was so immense, so raw. It made her own loneliness feel like a shallow pool next to a vast, dark ocean. When he fell silent, his eyes half closed, she found herself speaking, her own voice a quiet murmur in the small cave. She told him about Daniel, about his kindness and his quiet strength. She spoke of their dream of building a life in this hard land, a dream that now lay buried with him under the red dust. They were no longer a white woman and a Cheyenne man. They were just two people, their hearts broken by the same cruel world, sharing their stories of loss in a pocket of stillness while a storm raged around them. The fever worsened. Wak's shivering became violent, and his mind began to wander. He thrashed, his powerful body racked with tremors. Evelyn tried to hold him still, to soothe him. In his delirium, he suddenly grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. He stared at her, his eyes burning with a dark fire, but she sensed he was seeing something else, someone else. His lips moved, and the words he spoke were a fierce, desperate whisper. "Your body is mine until I have my sons." The words, the very same words that had once shocked and shamed her, struck her with an entirely different force now. Here, in the intimacy of the cave, stripped of their public context, they were not a claim of ownership. They were a plea, a vow. He was entrusting her with his quest, with the very purpose of his life. He was telling her that if the fever took him, his fight must become her fight. It was a promise of survival, a sacred oath that bound them beyond life and death. If she were to fall, he would honor her memory. He would protect her name. It was a warrior's pledge, the deepest expression of trust he could offer. Tears welled in her eyes. She placed her other hand over his. She whispered back that she understood. She would not fail him. Her quiet promise seemed to reach him through the haze of the fever. His grip loosened slightly, and the frantic light in his eyes softened. The rigid lines of his body relaxed, and he finally succumbed to a restless, exhausted sleep. Evelyn did not pull her hand away. She stayed there beside him, her hand in his, as the storm slowly began to spend its fury, her fear for him a living thing, a stark contrast to the trust that had finally, irrevocably, taken root in her heart. The storm passed as if it had never been, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The sun rose into a sky of pale, cloudless blue, and the air smelled of wet dust and sage. Inside the cave, the fragile peace was a lie. Wak's fever had not broken. He lay in a state of restless half-consciousness, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. Evelyn watched him, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. Beside her, Dr. Pike wrung his hands, his face a portrait of helpless anxiety. "The infection is winning," the doctor said, his voice a strained whisper. "Without proper medicine, without boiling water to make a poultice, I do not know what more I can do." He stood and paced the small confines of the cave, his agitation growing with every step. "I cannot just sit here and watch him die." He stopped and looked at Evelyn, a sudden, desperate idea in his eyes. "I must go out. Scout ahead. There are plants in these hills, remedies the natives use. I know some of them. Willow bark can reduce a fever, and there is a type of moss that fights corruption in a wound. I can find them. I will be faster if I go alone." Evelyn hesitated. The thought of being left alone with a delirious, dying man was terrifying, but the thought of doing nothing was worse. She looked at the doctor's earnest, worried face. He had helped them, risked his own safety by meeting with them. She had no reason to doubt his intentions. His fear seemed a natural response to their dire situation. "Be careful. Jonah," she said, using his first name for the first time. "The land is not forgiving." "I will not go far," he promised, gathering a small canvas bag. "I will be back before midday." He gave Wak a final, troubled look and then slipped out of the cave, disappearing into the bright morning sun. Hours crawled by. The sun climbed high in the sky, beating down on the rocks outside and turning the cave into an oven. Evelyn used the last of their water to keep a damp cloth on Wak's forehead. He tossed and turned, murmuring in his own language, his words a stream of fevered poetry she could not understand. A few times, he seemed to surface from the depths of his delirium. He would open his eyes, his gaze unfocused, and look at her. Once, he reached out and gripped her arm, his fingers surprisingly cool against her skin. "The doctor," he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "He smells of fear, but it is not fear of the wild." Then his eyes glazed over, and he was gone again, lost in the fever's labyrinth. His words planted a seed of unease in Evelyn's heart. She pushed it down, telling herself it was just the fever talking. Yet she could not shake it. She found herself glancing at the cave entrance more and more frequently. Midday came and went. The shadows began to lengthen. The doctor was not back. The silence of the plains was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, menacing. The sound, when it came, was not the sound of a man on foot. It was the jingle of a bridle, the tired snort of a horse. Her heart leaped with a false hope, thinking the doctor had found help. She moved to the mouth of the cave and peered out. Her blood ran cold. There were 5 riders, picking their way carefully through the rocks. They were not a posse. They were Thorne's men. She could tell by their hard, predatory posture. In the lead was a man with a scarred face and a cruel twist to his mouth she had not seen before. And riding beside him, looking small and pale on a borrowed horse, was Dr. Jonah Pike. Betrayal was a physical shock, a blow to the gut that stole her breath. Wak's words came back to her, a prophecy fulfilled. He smelled of fear. It was not fear for them. It was fear for himself. There was no time for anger, no time for anything but survival. She scrambled back into the cave. "Wak," she whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. "They are here. Thorne's men. The doctor led them to us." Somehow, her words pierced the fog of his fever. His eyes flew open, and this time they were clear, burning with a cold, primal fire. The warrior was back. He struggled to sit up, His body weak and trembling, but his will a thing of forged steel. He saw the truth in her face and did not waste a moment on questions. "We must move," he said, his voice low and guttural. "The cave is a trap." He pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the rock wall. Every movement was an agony, but he pushed through it. He looked around the small space, his eyes falling on the shotgun she had managed to retrieve from her wagon during her nighttime journey back to the farm. It was propped in a corner, loaded and ready. He nodded toward it. "Can you use that?" "I can," she said, her voice tight. The gun felt unnaturally heavy in her hands. They slipped out the back of the cave through a narrow crack in the rock that Walk's keen eyes had spotted. It opened onto a steep, shale-covered slope that led down into a small, marshy basin, a patch of startling green in the arid landscape, fed by some hidden spring. Reeds grew thick and tall, and the air was alive with the hum of insects. It was their only hope for cover. They had just reached the edge of the marsh when a shout echoed from above. They had been seen. A gunshot cracked, and a bullet whined past Evelyn's ear, smacking into the muddy ground beside her. They plunged into the reeds, the cool water a shock to their hot skin. The mud sucked at their boots, trying to drag them down. Walk, weakened by the fever and his bad leg, stumbled and fell to one knee. Evelyn grabbed him, pulling him up, her own strength fueled by adrenaline and terror. They pushed deeper into the marsh, the reeds closing around them, their sharp leaves scratching at their faces and hands. The riders dismounted, following them into the swamp on foot. They moved with a clumsy, cursing fury, the water slowing them down. "Thorne wants the Indian alive," the scarred man shouted. The woman, too, spread out, flushed them into the open. Walk found a small island of solid ground, a clump of earth held together by the roots of a half-dead willow tree. He sank down behind it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He pulled his knife. It looked like a child's toy against the rifles of their pursuers. "Go," he whispered to Evelyn, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Get away. Give the papers to someone, a marshal, anyone." "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. She raised the shotgun, its twin barrels looking like two dark, hollow eyes. One of the men came crashing through the reeds, not 10 yards from their hiding place. He was young, with a vacant, cruel face. He saw them, and a triumphant grin spread across his features. He raised his rifle. Evelyn did not think. She did not aim. She simply pointed the shotgun in his direction and pulled both triggers. The roar was deafening, a physical blow that slammed her back against the willow tree. The recoil was a mule's kick to her shoulder, a brutal, numbing impact. Acrid smoke filled the air, burning her eyes and throat. Through the haze, she saw the young man thrown backward, his chest a ruined mess. He fell into the murky water with a splash and did not move again. Silence. The buzzing of the insects seemed to amplify, to fill the sudden, terrible void left by the shotgun's blast. The other men had stopped, stunned by the sudden, savage violence. Evelyn stared at the spot where the man had fallen, her mind a blank slate. She had just killed a man. The knowledge was a distant, cold fact, something that had happened to someone else. Then the scarred man's voice, raw with fury, broke the spell. "The witch has a shotgun. Get her!" A volley of shots ripped through the reeds around them. Bark flew from the willow tree. Walk cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pain. He slumped forward. A dark stain was spreading across his side, a fresh wound, deep and serious. The world narrowed for Evelyn. There was only Walk, bleeding in the mud, and the men who were coming to kill them. The woman who had wept for her dead husband, who had flinched from the sight of a dead rabbit, was gone. In her place was someone cold and clear and filled with a rage that burned away all fear. She reloaded the shotgun, her hands moving with a clumsy but desperate speed. She helped Walk to his feet, half dragging, half carrying him. He was barely conscious, his weight a terrible burden. She pushed them deeper into the swamp, into the water that was now up to their waists. She knew they could not outrun them. They could only hide. She found a deep channel where the water was over her head, a place where the reeds grew so thick they formed a solid wall. She pushed Wak ahead of her, holding his head above the water, and submerged herself until only her eyes and nose were exposed. She held the shotgun aloft, keeping it dry. She listened, her entire being focused on the sounds of her hunters. She heard them sloshing through the water, cursing the mud and the reeds. They passed by their hiding place, so close she could have reached out and touched them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds began to recede. "Let them go," she heard the scarred man say from a distance. "He is hit bad. The swamp will finish them. Let us go back and tell Thorn the job is done." Evelyn waited, unmoving, until the last sound of them had faded away, replaced once more by the drone of the insects. She pulled Wak onto a small hummock of grass, his body limp. He was alive, but barely. She looked down at her hands, covered in mud and gunpowder. They were the hands of a killer. She had taken a life to save a life. The line between innocence and survival had been erased, washed away in the bloody water of the swamp. She was no longer just the widow of Willow Creek. She was a woman who knew how to use a gun, a woman who would kill to protect what was right. And as she tore another strip from her dress to staunch the flow of Wak's blood, she knew, with a grim and terrible certainty, that this was only the beginning. The swamp offered no lasting refuge. As darkness fell, it became a cold, living thing, its murky water sucking the warmth from their bodies, its night sounds a chorus of unseen threats. Wak drifted in and out of consciousness, his life held by the thinnest of threads. Evelyn held his head above the water, her own body numb with cold and exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled her in the fight had long since drained away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She knew they were trapped. Wak was too heavy to move, too weak to help. All she could do was wait. Sometime before dawn, they were found, not by the main party, but by two trackers sent back to retrieve the body of the man she had killed. They moved through the reeds like ghosts, their moccasins making no sound in the mud. They found Evelyn huddled over Wak's still form, the shotgun lying uselessly beside her, its powder wet. She had no fight left in her. She could only watch with dull, exhausted eyes as they pulled Wak from the water and bound her hands. They did not speak to her. They treated her not as a person, but as an object, a piece of cargo to be delivered. The journey to the shadow mine was a blur of pain and humiliation. They were thrown onto horses, her hands tied to the saddle horn. Wak slumped over the back of another horse like a sack of grain. They rode hard, the sun climbing into the sky and beating down on them without mercy. The landscape shifted, growing more hostile and alien. The earth turned a bruised, purplish color, and the cliffs that rose on either side of them were jagged and black, as if the land itself had been burned. They entered a narrow canyon, a deep wound in the earth that the sun never fully touched. The air grew colder, thick with the metallic tang of lead and the fine, choking dust that coated everything. The sounds of industry echoed off the high rock walls, the rhythmic clang of hammers on steel, the groaning complaint of a winch, and beneath it all, a sound that was far more terrible than near silence of dozens of working children. The mine was a true hell. A crude wooden structure clung to the cliff face, from which a massive iron bucket descended into a black pit. All around it, small, hunched figures sorted through piles of rock, their movements slow and listless. They were children, some no older than 7 or 8, from a dozen different tribes, their faces smudged with dirt and despair, their eyes ancient and empty. Guards armed with rifles stood on platforms above them, watching their every move. They were dragged from their horses and thrown onto the dusty ground before a small, well-built cabin that was starkly out of place in the grim camp. The door opened, and Victor Thorne stepped out. He was not the monster Evelyn had imagined. He was handsome, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked more like a banker than a slaver. He smiled, a confident, charming expression that did not reach his cold, gray eyes. "The widow Whitfield," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "And the warrior, Joaquinian. I am so pleased you could finally join me. You have caused me a great deal of trouble." Joac was barely conscious, his head lolling to one side. Evelyn pushed herself to her knees, her eyes blazing with a hatred that surprised her with its intensity. "You are a monster," she spat, the word tasting of dust and bile. Thorne's smile widened. He strolled over to her and crouched down, his face close to hers. He smelled of soap and cologne, a scent so clean and civilized it was obscene in this place of filth. "A monster," he mused, tapping a finger against his chin. "On the contrary, my dear, I am a visionary. I am a force for progress." He gestured to the children working in the dust. "Look at them. Before I found them, they were living in filth, chasing rabbits for their supper, their minds filled with savage superstitions. I have given them purpose. I am teaching them the value of discipline, of industry. I am molding them into a new generation, one that will understand its place in the modern world. I am giving them a future." The twisted logic, the absolute, unshakable self-righteousness of the man was more terrifying than any simple brutality. He truly believed his own lies. He saw his cruelty as a kindness, his greed as a noble mission. "You have stolen their childhoods," Evelyn said, her voice shaking with rage. "You have stolen their families." "Families are a sentimental notion," Thorne said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "They hold a people back. Here, they have a new family, the family of labor." He looked over at Joac's still form. "He understands. The old ways are dying. He tried to walk in our world, as a scout, but in the end, his savage blood was too strong. A pity. He could have been useful." Thorne stood up, dusting off his trousers. "Take them to the cage. Let the warrior see the fruits of my civilizing mission. It will be educational for him." The guards dragged them to a large iron cage set against the canyon wall. It was meant for holding animals, not people. They threw Joac onto the dirt floor and locked Evelyn in with him, the heavy door clanging shut. From inside the cage, they had a clear view of the entire mining operation, a constant, panoramic view of hell. Evelyn crawled to Joac's side. His new wound was a ragged tear in his side, clumsily bandaged by one of the trackers. His fever was raging again. She feared he would die there, in that cage, without ever seeing his sons. She tore a piece of her sleeve and gently cleaned the blood from his face, her touch a small, desperate act of tenderness in a world devoid of it. Toward evening, as the light in the canyon began to fail, a group of children was herded past their cage on their way to a long, low bunkhouse. They were chained together at the ankles, their small feet shuffling in the dust. And then Joac, who had been moaning softly in his delirium, went still. His eyes opened. They were clear, and they were fixed on the line of children. Two boys, a little taller than the others, were near the end of the line. Their faces were thin and smudged with grime, their hair matted, but it was them. Talon and Yanni. They walked with their heads down, but as they passed the cage, the older boy, Talon, glanced up. His eyes met his father's. For a single, heart-stopping moment, the boy's face, which had been a mask of dull exhaustion, was transformed. Recognition, shock, and then a terrible, soul-deep fear flashed in his eyes. He quickly looked away, pulling his younger brother closer, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. The sight broke something inside Joac. A sound tore from his throat, a sound of such profound agony that it was barely human. It was the sound of a father's heart being ripped from his chest. He lunged at the bars of the cage, his weak body infused with a sudden, impossible strength. He shook the iron door, roaring with a fury that echoed through the canyon. The guards laughed. The children flinched. His sons did not look back. The rage left him as quickly as it had come. He collapsed to the floor, his body racked with sobs. The warrior was gone. The proud scout was gone. All that was left was a father, helpless to protect his children from the horrors of the world. He curled into a ball, his face pressed into the dirt, his shoulders shaking with a grief so immense it seemed to suck all the air from the cage. Evelyn watched him, her own heart shattering. There were no words. What comfort could she offer in the face of such a loss? Any attempt would be a hollow insult. She knelt beside him, her mind a blank wall of shared despair. She did not think. She only felt. She placed a trembling hand on his shoulder, then gently on his cheek, turning his face toward her. His eyes were a storm of pain, a place where all hope had gone to die. Leaning in, she pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion or of romance. It was a kiss of shared pain, a desperate, silent communication of a grief too deep for words. It was a gesture that said, "I see you. I see your suffering. I am here with you in this darkness, and you are not alone." It was a small, fragile light in an overwhelming blackness, a moment of profound human connection in a place built on inhumanity. When she pulled away, the sobs had subsided, replaced by a shuddering stillness. He did not speak, but he looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not a lover, but a fellow soul, another captive in the canyon of despair. The kiss had been a sacrament of shared despair, but in its wake, something in Evelyn shifted. The despair did not vanish, but it hardened, condensing from a paralyzing fog into a single, sharp point of purpose. She looked at Wak, curled on the floor of the cage, his great strength broken not by wounds, but by a father's grief. She would not let this be the end. She would not let Thorn win. For a day and a night, she was a model prisoner. She tended to Wak, spooning the thin, foul-tasting gruel and brackish water the guards brought them into his mouth. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, words he did not seem to hear. But all the while, she was watching. She watched the guards, their lazy routines, their overconfidence. She watched the way the setting sun cast long shadows from the canyon walls, creating rivers of darkness. And she worked with a small, rusted nail she had prized from a loose floorboard in the cage. She began to pick at the primitive lock on their door. Her fingers grew raw. Her nails broke. But she worked with a patient, relentless focus. Wak slowly surfaced from his sea of grief. The fever still burned in him, but his mind was clearing. He saw what she was doing. He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, in the deepest part of the night, when the only sounds were the distant cry of a coyote and the snores of a drunken guard, he spoke, his voice a dry whisper. "There is a storehouse for the black powder at the south end of the camp, near the cliff wall." He paused, gathering his strength. "My people are watching. They are in the high rocks, waiting. They have been waiting for days. The signal is a fire, a great fire, from the place of the enemy." The plan, his last desperate gambit, was now hers to command. The knowledge settled in her not as a burden, but as a weapon. Just before dawn, the pin in the lock finally gave way with a soft, metallic click. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent camp. She froze, listening, but no one stirred. She pushed the door open a crack. The air was cold and sharp. She looked back at Wak. He was too weak to fight, but he pushed himself into a sitting position, his knife in his hand, ready to sell his life to buy her a few more seconds. She slipped out of the cage, a shadow among shadows. Moving through the camp was like walking on a sleeping dragon. The fires had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, demonic light on the crude buildings and the sleeping forms of the guards. She kept to the deepest darkness, her bare feet making no sound on the dusty ground. The skills Wak had taught her, how to move and listen and be a part of the night, came back to her now, not as lessons, but as instinct. She found the powder shed easily. It was a stout wooden building, set apart from the others. A single, sleepy guard posted by the door. She circled around to the back, where the wall was made of rough-hewn logs. A sliver of a moon provided just enough light for her to see the dark, sticky streaks of pine tar used to seal the gaps. It was flammable. She found a discarded piece of burlap and a small tin of lantern oil near a pile of supplies. Working quickly, silently, she stuffed the oil-soaked cloth into a wide crack between the logs. From a nearby fire pit, she took a stick with a single glowing ember at its tip. She had only one chance. She laid the smoldering stick at the base of the wall, near the oiled burlap. It would take a few minutes for the ember to ignite the cloth, a few minutes to get away. As she crept back toward the center of the camp, the sky began to bleed with the first pale light of dawn. A cold, steady rain began to fall. Not a downpour, but a persistent, soaking drizzle that hissed on the embers of the campfires. She was halfway to the children's bunkhouse when the world exploded. A deep, gut-shaking roar tore through the canyon, followed by a wave of heat that flattened the grass. The powder shed vanished in a blossom of brilliant orange flame that shot 100 feet into the air, momentarily turning the rain to steam and illuminating the canyon with a terrifying, artificial daylight. The explosion was the signal, before its echo had even died. War cries answered from the canyon rim, high, ululating sounds that seemed to come from the sky itself. Figures appeared on the cliff tops, silhouetted against the fire in the dawn. Cheyenne warriors. They flowed down the rocks like a silent, deadly river, armed with bows and rifles. The camp erupted into chaos. Thorne's men, startled from their sleep, scrambled for their weapons, their shouts of alarm turning to screams of pain. The battle was a maelstrom of fire and water, of modern rifles and ancient bows. The rain grew heavier, turning the dust to a slick, red mud, washing the blood from the ground as soon as it was spilled. In the confusion, Evelyn ran to the cage. Wak was on his feet, holding the bars, his face a mask of grim triumph. She threw the door open. He staggered out, grabbing the rifle from the dead guard she had taken it from. He was weak, but his eyes burned with the fire of a wolf defending its den. "My sons," he rasped, and started toward the bunkhouse. Evelyn's path was blocked. The scarred man, the one who had led the trackers in the swamp, stood before her, his face a snarl of rage. He had a pistol in his hand. "The witch," he sneered, wiping rain from his face. "I should have left you for the gators." She had no weapon but the small knife she still carried. She knew she was no match for him in a direct fight. He raised his pistol, but at that moment, a Cheyenne warrior on horseback galloped past, swinging a war club that caught the man a glancing blow on the shoulder, sending him staggering. His pistol flew from his hand, landing in the mud. Evelyn saw her chance. She ran, not away from him, but past him, toward the wreckage of the armory. She found what she was looking for, her shotgun, lying where it had been tossed in a pile of confiscated weapons. She turned, loading it as she moved. The scarred man was coming for her again, his own knife now in his hand. "I will enjoy this," he growled, lunging at her. She fired from the hip. The blast caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling into the mud. He screamed, a sound of agony and fury. She stood over him, the rain plastering her hair to her face, the smoking shotgun in her hands. She could have finished him. The woman from the swamp, the killer, was still inside her. But she looked at his face, twisted in pain, and saw not a monster, but just a pathetic, beaten man. She turned and walked away. leaving him to the justice of the victors. Meanwhile, Wak had reached the bunkhouse. He threw open the door to find the children huddled together in terror. He saw Talon and Yanni, and his heart cried out. But his face remained a mask of stone. He cut the chains that bound them with a few sharp blows from a hatchet he found. He spoke to them in his own language, his voice calm and reassuring. Victor Thorn found him there. He stood in the doorway, his fine suit spattered with mud, a small, elegant pistol in his hand. His face was a mask of cold, incredulous fury. "Savage," he hissed. "You have destroyed everything." "You built nothing," Wak said, pushing his sons behind him. He stood, his borrowed rifle held loosely in his hands, his body swaying with weakness. "You only stole. Now it is time to pay." Thorn fired. The bullet went wide, splintering the door frame. Wak did not fire back. He dropped the rifle and charged, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was wounded, exhausted, but he moved with the last, desperate speed of a dying panther. He crashed into Thorn before the man could fire again, sending them both tumbling out into the mud. It was a primal struggle. Thorn's civilized pistol against Wak's knife. Thorn fought with a desperate, flailing strength, but Wak fought with a purpose that was as old as the rocks around them. He took a blow to the head that made the world spin, but he twisted, bringing his knife up, not to kill, but to disarm. He sliced the tendons in Thorn's wrist. The pistol dropped from a hand that would never hold a gun again. Wak pressed the tip of his knife to Thorn's throat, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged sobs of exertion and release. He had won. The battle was over. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, washing the smoke from the air. The fires hissed and died. The surviving guards had surrendered. Evelyn found Wak standing over Thorn, his two sons clinging to his legs. He looked up, and their eyes met across the muddy, corpse-strewn camp. She walked toward him, her steps slow and unsteady. They were both survivors of a private war. They were covered in mud and blood, their clothes torn, their bodies bruised, but they were alive. He pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him, her strength finally giving out. He held her, his arms a circle of warmth and safety in the cold, wet dawn. It was not the embrace of lovers. Not yet. It was the desperate, clinging embrace of two people who had walked through the fire and the flood together and had, against all odds, found their way to the other side. The aftermath of battle was an eerie quiet, punctuated by the moans of the wounded and the steady, cleansing sound of the rain. Wak's people moved with a grim efficiency, tending to their own, binding the hands of Thorn's surviving men and gathering the children into a protective huddle. The fire in the powder shed had died, leaving a blackened, smoldering crater that smelled of wet ash and sulfur. Wak and Evelyn stood apart from the chaos, a small island of stillness. The bond forged in the cage and the fight held them together, a silent understanding that needed no words, but their paths, which had run so violently together, were already beginning to diverge. Wak's gaze was fixed on his sons. Talon and Yanni stood beside him, their small hands clutching his buckskin leggings, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe as they looked at the father who had come back from the dead to save them. His duty was to them now, to lead them away from this place of ghosts and back to the world of their people. Evelyn's duty lay in the oilcloth pouch she still clutched in her hand. It contained the proof, the weapon of the white man's world, and she knew it was the only thing that could truly tear down Victor Thorn's empire of dust and lies. "I must take them to the winter camp," Wak said, his voice low and heavy with exhaustion. He looked from his sons to Evelyn, and in his eyes she saw a profound, aching conflict. They need their grandmother's care. They need to hear the songs of our people, to remember who they are. "I understand," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Go, keep them safe." He reached out and his fingers brushed her cheek, a touch as light as a falling leaf. "You fought like a she-wolf." Evelyn Whitfield, my people will sing songs about the woman with the thunderstick. He then turned, and without another word, gathered his sons and melted into the ranks of the Cheyenne warriors. She watched him go until he was just another figure in the gray, rainy dawn. It was 2 days before a federal marshal, a square-jawed, weary-eyed man named Thompson, arrived with a troop of cavalry. They had been summoned by a frantic message from Sheriff Miller, who had finally found the courage to act after hearing the distant thunder of the explosion. The marshal found a scene of grim order. The Cheyenne were gone, having vanished back into the hills. The surviving children were being cared for by a few of the older native women who had come with the war party. Victor Thorne and his men, including a whimpering, feverish Dr. Pike, were bound and under guard. Marshal Thompson listened to Evelyn's story, his face an unreadable mask. He examined the papers from her husband's strongbox, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read the contracts and deciphered the ledger. He walked through the camp, his gaze taking in the crude bunkhouse, the chains, the empty, haunted faces of the rescued children. When he was done, he looked at Evelyn, his expression one of tired professionalism. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "what happened here was a vigilante action, and the law has a dim view of such things. But what Mr. Thorne was doing here, this is a crime that cries out to heaven for justice." He gestured to Thorne, who was now being helped onto a horse, his face a mask of arrogant indignation. "He will be tried in Copper Gulch. It is a territorial circuit court. Your testimony and these papers will be required." The trial of Victor Thorne was the biggest event the territory had seen in a decade. The courtroom in Copper Gulch was packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap perfume, and righteous anger. Evelyn sat on a hard wooden bench, a solitary figure in a clean but simple calico dress. The whispers followed her like a cloud of flies. She was the savage's woman, the traitor who had sided with Indians against her own kind. The women in their church bonnets stared at her with open hostility, their faces hard with judgment. The men looked at her with a different kind of interest, a crude curiosity that was just as insulting. Thorne's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from back east, painted a picture of a peaceful, productive mining operation attacked without provocation by a band of murderous savages, led by a woman of loose morals who had been bewitched by their leader. He called Thorne a pioneer, a captain of industry, a man bringing civilization to the wilderness. The first crack in Thorne's defense came from an unexpected source. Dr. Jonah Pike, pale and thin, was called to the stand. His hands trembled as he took the oath. He looked not at the lawyer, but at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a profound and miserable shame. In a low, halting voice, he confessed everything. He told the court about his fear, about how Thorne had threatened to ruin him if he did not cooperate. He described the children Thorne's men had brought to him, their bodies thin, their lungs filled with dust. And then he told them how he had betrayed Evelyn and Wak, leading Thorne's men to their hiding place. "I was a coward," he finished, his voice breaking. He was weeping openly now. "I let my fear make me a party to this evil, Evelyn Whitfield and the man they call Wak. They showed a courage I could only dream of. They did what was right, while I did what was easy." His testimony sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She walked to the witness stand, her back straight, her head held high. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, but she met them without flinching. Thorne's lawyer approached her like a wolf circling a lamb. He questioned her character, her relationship with Wak, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Is it not true, Mrs. Whitfield," he purred, "that you and this savage were intimate, that you willingly abandoned your own people to consort with him?" "He saved my life," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady, "and I helped him save his sons." "You helped him lead a massacre," the lawyer thundered. "I helped him stop a monster," she countered, her voice ringing with a strength she had not known she possessed. She presented the papers. She explained the water rights contract, the proof that Thorne had built his fortune on a lie. She showed them the ledger, the cold, damning record of his trade in children. The courtroom was silent, every person leaning forward, captivated. The lawyer, seeing his case crumbling, made one last, desperate attack. He stepped close, his voice a venomous whisper meant for the whole room to hear. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitfield, what possible justice could there be in siding with savages against your own people?" Evelyn looked at the lawyer, at the jury, at the faces in the crowd, a sea of white, judging faces. And she thought of Wak, of his grief and his courage. She thought of his sons, and of all the other children who had been stolen from their families. She stood, her small frame filled with a towering dignity. "Justice," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Don't wear one skin color." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. She had not shouted. She had not argued. She had simply spoken a truth so profound and so self-evident that it shattered every prejudice, every easy assumption in the room. From the back of the courtroom, standing in the shadows near the door, a tall figure watched. Wak had come. He had left his sons with his sister and had ridden for 2 days, unable to stay away. He stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, his 2 sons standing quietly beside him. He could not understand all the lawyer's words, but he understood the sneer in his voice, and he understood the unwavering strength in Evelyn's. He watched her stand alone, a small, brave woman facing down the hatred of her entire world, and his heart swelled with a feeling that was equal parts pride and a deep, cutting sadness. He was proud of her courage, of her unshakable sense of what was right, but he was also pierced by the certainty that they were worlds apart. She belonged here, in this room of words and laws, a world he could never truly be a part of. He had his sons, he had his people, but the bond he shared with this woman was something unique and powerful, a thing that had no place in either of their worlds. As she stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes swept the crowd and found his. For a long moment, their gazes locked across the packed room. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In her eyes, he saw her victory. In his, she saw his pride and his sorrowful farewell. The judgment at Copper Gulch had been delivered, but for them, a different, more personal verdict had also been reached. Victor Thorne was convicted. The words, delivered by a grim-faced jury foreman, seemed too small for the weight of the crimes they condemned. He was sentenced to life in the federal prison at Leavenworth, a fate many in the courtroom considered too merciful. His empire of dust and cruelty, built on a foundation of stolen water and stolen lives, had crumbled into nothing. Dr. Pike, for his testimony and his confession, received a lesser sentence, his public shame a punishment as severe as any prison cell. Evelyn returned to Willow Creek not as a pariah, but as a reluctant hero. The same faces that had once stared at her with contempt now looked away in shame, or offered hesitant, mumbled greetings. The town had been forced to look into a dark mirror, and it did not like the reflection it saw. No one spoke of the trial, but a quiet, grudging respect settled around her like a winter cloak. She was no longer just the widow Whitfield, nor the savage's woman. She was the woman who had spoken the truth, a truth that had, in its own way, set them all free. The first frost came, a silver blanket over the dry grass, and with it, the hard work of preparing for winter. Evelyn returned to her farm, to the small, silent cabin that was now truly hers. The creek, the source of so much bloodshed, now ran full and clear, its cheerful gurgle a constant song of victory. She repaired the fence Pete and his men had broken, her hands sure and steady. She harvested the last of her meager crops. The work was hard and lonely, but it was a good loneliness, a clean loneliness, one of choice and not of circumstance. Each night, she would build a fire in the hearth, the flames a welcome dance of light and warmth against the growing cold. And from her window, as she looked out across the vast, darkening prairie, she would often see another fire. It was a small, solitary point of orange light, miles away, down by the bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grew thickest. It was Wok's fire. He had not returned to the distant lands of his people. After the trial, a council was held between the Cheyenne elders and Marshal Thompson. A new treaty was drawn, not on paper, but on a handshake and a shared understanding. The water of Willow Creek, the document from Daniel's strongbox had proven, belonged to the land and all who lived on it, to ensure it was never again used as a weapon. The Cheyenne had proposed a guardian, someone from their own tribe who would watch over the waterway, a position the marshal, weary of endless conflict, had wisely endorsed. They had chosen Wok, and so he made his camp by the creek, a small lodge of hide and willow branches. He was a sentry, a man of peace tasked with preventing the kind of war he had just survived. His 2 sons were with him, their laughter once again echoing in the crisp autumn air. The haunted, vacant look they had worn at the mine was slowly being replaced by the bright, curious eyes of boyhood. He spent his days teaching them, not the ways of the warrior, but the ways of the land, the names of the stars, the language of the birds. He was rebuilding their stolen childhoods, one story, one lesson at a time. Their 2 fires burned in parallel, a silent conversation held in smoke and flame across the vast, empty space that separated them. Hers was a fire of the hearth, of home and new beginnings. His was a fire of the camp, of tradition and watchful solitude. They were 2 separate worlds, 2 separate lives, warmed by a shared memory of a trial by fire. One afternoon, a small delegation of Cheyenne women came to Evelyn's farm. They came on foot, their faces solemn, and laid a bundle of beautifully tanned beaver pelts and a pouch of dried herbs on her doorstep. They spoke no English, and she spoke no Cheyenne, but they did not need a common language. Their eyes, filled with a deep and solemn gratitude, said everything. Their children were home because of her. The encounter sparked an idea in Evelyn's mind, a seed of purpose that took root in the fertile ground of her newfound strength. A few days later, she walked to Wok's camp. He was teaching Talon how to fletch an arrow, his large hands guiding his son's small ones. He saw her coming and stood, his face revealing nothing. "I want to start a school," she said, without preamble, "in my cabin, for the children, yours, and any others who wish to learn." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. To learn the white man's words, to read his books. To learn to read any words, she corrected him gently. So they will never again be cheated by a piece of paper they cannot understand. So they can know the law and use it as a shield, not just feel it as a sword. He was silent for a long time, watching his sons chase a grasshopper through the dry grass. "It is a good plan," he said at last. "A wise plan." And so, the school began. 3 days a week, a small group of children would make the journey from the Cheyenne camp to Evelyn's farm. Talon and Yanni were the first to arrive, their initial shyness quickly giving way to a fierce, bright curiosity. Soon, they were joined by a few of the town's children, sent by parents who, humbled by the trial, saw the wisdom in building bridges rather than walls. In the small, warm cabin, the children of the settlers and the children of the Cheyenne sat side by side, learning their letters, their voices mingling as they sounded out the strange, new words. Evelyn taught them, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce joy she had not felt in years. Wok never came to the school, but sometimes, in the late afternoon, he would stand on the ridge overlooking her farm, a tall, solitary figure watching the children play in the yard. He and Evelyn rarely spoke. Their encounters were brief, dictated by chance and the quiet rhythms of their new lives. He would sometimes leave a brace of rabbits on her porch in the morning, and she would leave a fresh loaf of bread on a stump near his camp in the evening. They were simple gifts, the offerings of neighbors, yet they were freighted with an unspoken meaning, a testament to the bond between them. Their love was a thing born of survival and tempered by loss. It had no need for declarations or promises. It existed in the quiet spaces between them, in the shared glances across a field, in the mutual respect that flowed as deep and as clear as the creek itself. There would be no wedding, no joining of their two worlds. They had both lost too much, had been too deeply scarred, to believe in such simple fairy tales. Their love was a more realistic, more resilient thing. It was a love that asked for nothing and understood everything. It was the quiet warmth of two fires burning through a long, cold winter, each keeping the other in sight, a promise of light in the vast, surrounding darkness. 5 years is a lifetime on the frontier. It is long enough for a raw wound to become a faded scar, for a bitter memory to soften into a lesson. It is long enough for a parched creek bed to learn the song of running water again, and for a town built on fear and division to begin the slow, hard work of healing. The Willow Creek of 1877 was not the same place that had once thirsted for Wach's blood and scorned Evelyn's name. The water, now shared by all according to the rights laid out in Daniel Whitfield's papers, had brought a quiet prosperity. New homesteads, drawn by the promise of fairness, had sprung up along the valley. The town had a new general store, a blacksmith who could shoe a mule without cursing, and a small, neat courthouse that stood where the old saloon had once been. Inside that courthouse, in a simple glass case, rested a rusted iron strongbox. Schoolchildren were sometimes brought to look at it, a relic from the town's own dark age. It was a testament to a simple, hard-won truth that the law, when honored, could be a shield for the weak, not just a club for the strong. Evelyn's school was no longer held in her small cabin. A proper schoolhouse had been built by the men of the town and the men of the Cheyenne, working side by side. It stood on a small rise between the town and the creek, a bridge of wood and learning. Inside, the voices of children mingled, reciting multiplication tables in English and then naming the constellations in Cheyenne. Evelyn was no longer just a teacher. She was an institution, a quiet, respected woman whose courage had become the town's founding legend. Wach's sons were now young men. Talon, tall and thoughtful, had his father's eyes and a gift for understanding the intricate workings of the white man's world. He could read a legal document as easily as he could read a deer track. Yanni, still quick to laugh, had his mother's spirit and a deep love for the stories and songs of his people. They walked in two worlds with a confidence and grace that their father had never been allowed, their very existence a promise of a different future. Wach still kept his camp by the cottonwoods, but his role as guardian had become a formality. The water flowed freely, its use governed by a council of homesteaders and Cheyenne elders who met twice a year in Evelyn's schoolhouse. He was a respected figure, a man whose quiet wisdom was sought by both peoples. The fierce, vengeful warrior had been replaced by a peacemaker, a man who had won his war and now dedicated his life to ensuring it would never have to be fought again. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The winters were still hard, the summers still hot, but the desperate, clawing struggle for survival had eased. There was a sense of community now, fragile but real, a community that had been bought with blood and tears, and was now nurtured by forgiveness and a shared desire for peace. One bright afternoon in late spring, when the cottonwood trees were releasing their seeds like a soft, white snow, and the creek was running high with melted snow from the mountains, Evelyn walked down to the water's edge. The air was sweet with the scent of damp earth and new blossoms. She stood for a long time, watching the current, a ribbon of silver and blue flowing through the heart of the valley. She was not surprised when Wach appeared beside her, his footsteps making no sound on the soft grass. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, a silence built of 5 years of shared glances, of unspoken understanding, of 2 fires burning in the night. He was leaner than he had been, the lines on his face carved a little deeper by time and sun, but his eyes were calm, the old storm in them having long since passed. He looked at the laughing children playing near the schoolhouse, a mix of brown and white faces, their voices carrying on the gentle breeze. He looked at the green field stretching out from the creek, the promise of a good harvest. He looked at the town, peaceful in the afternoon sun. Then he looked at her. "You kept your promise, widow," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, like distant thunder. "My sons live, my people live." She turned to him, a small, gentle smile touching her lips. The name, widow, no longer held the sting of loss. It was what he called her, a name that held all the history that lay between them, a term of respect, of a unique and unbreakable intimacy. She looked into his dark, steady eyes, the eyes of the man who had saved her, who had claimed her, who had shared his deepest grief with her in a dark cage. "Then maybe my body was never yours," she answered, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "But my heart will always be." He did not move, did not speak. He simply held her gaze, and in that long, silent look, everything was said. Theirs was not a love that could be bound by a ceremony or given a name. It was a wild, resilient thing, a love born in violence and baptized in a river of blood, a love that had found its own quiet, unshakable peace. He reached out and his hand gently covered hers where it rested on the smooth bark of a willow tree. It was enough. The river ran clear, and the future, like the endless blue sky above them, was full of promise. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.